All right, welcome everyone. Today is Wednesday, the 9th of November, 2022, and this is the Cluster API project meeting. Cluster API is a sub-project of Kubernetes SIG, and as such, we are following their community guidelines, which essentially means please raise your hand if you'd like to speak, and also please treat each other as you would expect to be treated, which, to be explicit, is please be kind to each other. We will start off the meeting, and I would encourage everyone to add your name to the attending. We start every meeting with a chance for new attendees to the community to kind of introduce themselves or say hey. So if you are new here and would like to introduce yourself to the community, please feel free to unmute your mic or raise your hand. And yeah, we'll take a couple minutes right now, or a couple seconds.
Hey, I'm Joseph Foltz. I work with the dev crew at Microsoft, and we're just trying to kind of get our bearings around the community activities with Cluster API, specifically as we start to look at using the CAPZ provider for some of the work we're doing. And so we're trying to get kind of the full picture for CAPI and then kind of the smaller CAPZ community picture and understand how everything works.
Oh, welcome aboard, Joseph. Like, yeah, CAPZ, like you'll be right at home here.
Thank you.
All right, 3, 2, 1. All right, I'm not seeing any other hands going up, so we'll move on to the open proposal readout. Is there anyone here who would like to speak on, it looks like we only have label sync as the open proposal. Would anyone like to talk about that? All right, I'm not seeing any hands going up, so we will keep moving. So the discussion topics for today, it looks like Yuvraj, you're up first with Cluster API team handle.
Hi, everyone. So the Cluster API release team handles are now available in Slack and in GitHub. So we have a GitHub team in the Kubernetes 6 org. It's not available in the Kubernetes org, which I think should be fine for us. And we also have a Cluster API release team Slack handle. So for the 1.4 release cycle, which starts in a month, for anyone who wants assistance with the release team, or if the release team needs to be in loop, you can just use the handles to tag them on GitHub issues, PRs, or on Slack threads and so on.
Very cool. So if we have any issues, we can just kind of @ Cluster API release team on GitHub, and we should get in touch with the right people. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
All right, very cool. Thanks, Yuvraj. Stefan, you're up next with some release related notes here.
Yep, mostly PSAs, I think. Yeah, so first one, we released 1.2.5 on Tuesday, which has essentially, I think, mostly a few bug fixes and a change that our published manifests are now using the new registry. So if you actually run cluster init and the cluster API controller is pulled, it's now pulled from the new registry. It was published to both registries since, like, I don't know, a few months. And other notable bug fix, cluster cuddle move was, so when you were running cluster cuddle move on a cluster and all related resources, after the move, cluster cuddle owned fields, so managed fields, server-side apply, all that kind of stuff. Cluster cuddle took ownership of all fields, and with that bug fix, we now make sure that the managed fields before and after the move are exactly the same. Yeah, so that can have some unexpected effects if later on you try to modify the cluster. Probably mostly if you use actually server-side apply, which is not enabled per default in kubectl. But yeah, if you see some strange effects of clusters that you previously moved, if you're trying to drop fields and they're not dropped, or if you're trying to change fields and you get like, oh, conflict, think about that. That bug fix shouldn't happen from now on. Yeah, that's everything about 1.2.5. And then the beta. There are no real release notes, which is something that I added as an improvement task for. We should think about maybe adding something here, even if it's just expandable. But yeah, just a new release. New beta release. To be honest, I don't know noteworthy differences at that point. But yeah, if you're already trying to adopt the new version, bump to the new release, give us feedback. Always appreciate it. Yeah, and then the final one. So for the new release team, I finally opened the PR, which tries to document the responsibilities of different roles in the release team and all the tasks that we usually do during a release. Yeah, just want to ask for reviews here. I already got a lot. Thanks for that. I think we want to merge this probably in the next like 1 or 2 weeks. So not like immediately before the release team starts, but we definitely have another week or two to go through all those discussions.
It looks like there's a good discussion happening there too, so that's cool.
Yeah, definitely interesting for, I guess, the wider community, but especially for the release team, because we're trying to document down what the release team is usually doing during the release cycle. Yep. Okay. And then I hand over to Sagar, I think.
Yeah. Did you put the 1.3 changes in there as well?
Yes, but Sagar is the first point. So I get it.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. Okay, cool.
If there are no further questions, of course, to the release related updates.
Yeah. Did anybody have questions about the releases, the 1.25 or the 1.3.0 beta or 1.2.5? Sorry. All right. I'm not seeing any hands go up. So Sagar, if you want to talk about the TLS flags, I'd say go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, folks. So just a quick summary on this particular thing. So we just updated we just merged the PR in the main branch to expose 2 new flags around setting the TLS minimum version and the TLS cipher suites for the webhook server. The point of this PR is do we want to add this or these changes to the 1.3 version as well, and how do we want to document those? So at least from I've looked at from CapV's perspective, using this change directly in cluster API does not mean that there's any change that needs to be made directly in the providers if and when they move to the CAPI 1.3 version. So we just wanted to call this out in the offers if this is something that we should include migrate doc as well as a suggested change for the pros, just because the PR also introduces a couple of interventions that can be used by the providers if they want to implement similar changes.
Okay, and I see we put a hold on here for the office hours. Is there any question, or I guess do we need to find out if there's any objections to adding this, or?
I can provide slightly more context. So essentially, the first PR was changing things in core cluster API. And then I brought up the point, hey, should we document this for other providers? And essentially, we have our policy now, which says, hey, if you want to merge something after the first beta, which would affect providers' adoption of the new cluster API release, we should bring it up in office hours and just make sure that there are no objections from providers against adding that. So we went ahead with doing the change in core cluster API because that definitely has 0 impact on any providers. And the thing that has impact is essentially that we're documenting it. Hey, other providers, please also adopt this change. And yeah, the question is essentially, does anyone have a problem with us adding that note for the 1.2 to 1.3 migration guide? If yes, we would defer it for another release. Yeah, that's the question.
Okay, cool. And I see Fabrizio has his hand raised. Go ahead, Fabrizio.
Yeah, just a small note on top of this. So cluster API is not prescriptive on which flag each provider must expose. It is just a recommendation that we give in order to, let me say, be all consistent. So there is nothing prescriptive. So personally, I don't see problem in adding this in 1230, but of course, the last word is on providers.
All right, cool. Yeah, I mean, like, I guess for anyone who's here today or watching this, please go back to this PR if you have a strong objection to what's going on here, and add your comments there. Do we want to remove the hold in a couple days if nobody's added anything here, or do we need to even say that, I guess?
Yeah, I think maybe something like Friday or so is okay. I would really I would really like to get it in before the release candidate next week. Oh, sorry, Sagar, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say, like, I can raise this on Slack since this is slightly time sensitive and we want to like have visibility on this. Maybe I can just start it on Slack and see if anybody has any updates or any objections to this.
Yeah, I think putting it on Slack is probably a good idea as well. I just want to make sure that if we're trying to give some time for people to look at this and maybe raise their objections, and if they have any, maybe just putting a date here so we know, okay, if nobody has any objections by this time, we'll just move forward with it. All right, thanks, Sagar and Stefan and Fabrizio. Stefan, you've got the next about dependency bumps here.
Yep, and I think that one is as much about the concrete changes that you want to make as well as refining the policy. So as I mentioned before, we have that policy where we say, hey, all the changes that affect provider adoption should be brought up and approved. And the changes that are listed here is essentially bumping dependencies. So background is we want to make sure that when we do a cluster API release, we have up-to-date dependencies so that we reduce the risk of finding CVEs that are found later or missing features that someone wants to use, etc., etc. So all those bumps that are listed here, so Ginkgo, Gomika, Cobra, and Viper, they all require 0 code changes. So essentially, we bumped the dependencies. We didn't have to change a single line of code in core cluster API. And I assume it's the same for providers. All of them were minor release bumps. So I'm asking for 2 things. One thing, do we have a problem with those specific bumps? And the other thing, do you think that those kind of changes, that we have to bring them up while we are in beta? Because I think it should be fairly straightforward that we can bump dependencies on core copy until the first RC if the consequences that nobody really has to change code for that.
Yeah, I think speaking personally, I think it's nice to have these updates here so that I know for the providers that I'm working on, maybe it's time to go back and review those and bump them in my provider. And it's awesome to hear that there were no code changes. I guess, does anyone else have questions or comments about this? Like, should we be continuing to advertise when we do these kind of bumps? Is it helpful to other providers? Anyone have a question or comment or anything? I guess we'll take silence as total approval. So, I'd say if we're doing bumps like this, probably worth it to keep advertising, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in general, we try to do the bumps as early as possible. We just didn't, for the next release cycle, we will do it before the beta, and I have an explicit task for that. But just so much stuff going on for this release cycle. So I would go ahead with those bumps, and I'll open a PR to add a little bit more detail on changes that impact provider adoption, and then we can discuss on this PR if the framing that I would like to see there is okay or not, just write a regular PR review.
Cool, sounds good. Yeah, I think the important thing is when we have changes that do require code changes, those are the ones we need to make a lot of noise about, right? So
yeah, I think that's totally fair.
All right, cool. And you've got the next topic too, Stefan, so go ahead.
Yep. So the next one, I think I brought this up like, oh, I don't remember, a few weeks back. Essentially, we made a contract change, and the contract change was, hey, all the CRDs that are referenced in core cluster API resources and thus essentially consumed by core copy controller, they all have to follow a certain naming scheme. Essentially, what QBuilder is producing, but we now have our own util function which exposes, which generates the CRD name in the exactly right way. This PR is now adding a warning to clusterctl, so that if you run clusterctl init and you have a provider with invalid CRD name, you get a warning. And getting a warning means simply there is one log statement printed out with a big warning prefix. Nothing breaks at this point. It's just a warning. It was also verified that it works for all providers which are registered in clusterctl. And I talked to Furkat for Metal Free. They have one CRD, which is a false positive. He agreed to essentially do the change to a CRD, which is needed to not get this warning. So there's a way to opt out of this warning. So if you have CRDs, which are essentially just your own CRDs, they're not used by core copy controllers, and those the name of that CRD is wrong, then you can add an annotation, and that annotation tells clusterctl, hey, please skip that warning. I know that my CRD name is wrong, but it doesn't really matter. And Furkat will add this this annotation to this one Metal Free CRD. So as far as I know, once that annotation is there, we don't have any provider which would get this warning. I mean, I don't know about providers which are not registered in clusterctl, of course, but those are fine. Yeah. TLDR, if providers would have CRDs with wrong names, they would get a warning. It shouldn't affect any of the registered providers. And I bring this up because technically this could say that this affects providers adoption. So again, the same question, if anyone has any objections against merging this. The contract change was like a month or two ago.
Yeah, I guess like, because I noticed there's a hold on this too. Do we need to put something here as well? Like, you know, about if people have objections, they need to come like, you know, kind of talk here.
Yeah, we can do the same thing in my opinion, if nobody else, if no one has a problem with it. Friday is totally fine for me.
Do we want to say like, so I see some Fabrizio saying in chat +1 to merge. Do we want to say maybe on Friday we'll remove the hold on this one as well?
Yep, that's fine.
All right, cool. Thank you for the explanation there. And hopefully people will go take a look if they don't want to, you know, if they don't want to see that, but it sounds like we've already kind of agreed to it. So all right, so next topic is Jack Francis with something about machine pool annotations for external autoscalers. So take it away.
Yes. Hey, Mike, thanks very much. I'll paste a link in here. This will be quick. So I'll spare everyone the backstory on all of the PR thread thrashing, but thank you so much to a lot of folks, especially Stefan, Cecile, and there's a bunch of other folks. As you can see, there's been a lot of discussion. This is mostly ready to go. We've been aiming to include this prior to the 1.3 release. So the reason I brought this up in the office hours is there is one open question about, sorry, I haven't even described what this is. So this is a PR that introduces a new cluster API aware annotation for machine pools to indicate that the replica count of those machine pools is under the enforcement of an autoscaler. So there is one sort of non-invasive change to cluster API itself, which is that when this annotation is present, which would be applied by the provider, that's the idea here, we would make a subtle change to the way that Cluster API reports phase status during observed scaling operations. Because this annotation indicates that Cluster API is no longer responsible for doing the scaling, we change the status so it's not a sort of predictive status. So right now, as you can imagine, because Cluster API thinks of itself as the sole vector of enforcement for scaling, if it notices fewer replicas than it's actually sees in the wild, it can predict and say, I'm scaling up or I'm scaling down. So we changed that status message subtly to just say something like scaling. So we know that some scaling is occurring because there's a delta, but Cluster API doesn't attempt to predict it. So that's a little bit of the background here. The open question has to do with the whether the annotation is a specific, looks for a specific value, or whether it is a sort of, I say sort of, whether it's a Boolean-ish value, which is to say, there's some discussion in the thread about we want to treat the annotation like a bool. So if it's present, if the annotation exists, that means true, unless if someone explicitly sets it to false, that means false. So there's some like interesting conversation around why that might be a good or a bad idea. But I really just want to call out that that's the only open item. So if you have an opinion on that, please feel free to participate in this thread. Hopefully we'll get it merged in the next few business days in time for the 1.3 release.
Okay, cool. So the kind of the TLDR here is that if you have an opinion about this Boolean field there, please come and take a look at this and kind of add some comments.
Yeah, as is right now, we're essentially declaring an annotation with a well-known key and a well-known value, but there is some competing dissent for folks who would potentially prefer just a well-known key. Go ahead, Stefan.
Yeah, and I think one important thing to mention is, I mean, essentially that's a contract addition to the machine pool. So it would be really good to have other info providers looking at this and saying, okay, that's fine. I mean, I don't have any stakes in all of that. I'm fine. But it would be good. I don't know who implemented machine pools, but just to get some feedback from that side as well.
Yeah, so that's a really good call out for any providers who might be watching this on recording or here now. If you even have a thought that you might someday implement machine pools, it's probably worthwhile to take a look at this and understand the nuance that's going on here. Even if you're not thinking about doing it now, it's probably worthwhile just to be familiar with this. All right, any other?
And so the final comment I'll make is just to beware to all providers. I'll be pinging you to give you a chance to weigh in. So fair warning.
Cool. Thanks, Jack. Does anybody have questions or comments about this? Yeah, Vince, go ahead.
Just one. I haven't looked at the latest on this, but where are we at with the dissent on like it as being like autoscaler specific, I guess, or just like something else?
I think we've converged where this is an autoscaler specific thing. The question is, do we leave open some flexibility for that in the future so assuming that the value is significant, that would give us some future flexibility to add a slightly different related well-known annotation plus value to this. So Vince, you suggested that we use we sort of carry over a well-known pattern of replicas managed by as the key. So basically get rid of the autoscaler stuff from the key. So the open question is, do we move that into the value and then that becomes the contract? Like external autoscaler being an example of a value string that is the contract? Or do we take that replicas managed by and just turn that into a Boolean and accept any value as true, and then sort of implicitly have the autoscaler be the reason why we use this? And so, I'm in favor of having the value be significant and having the value carry the autoscaler semantics in it, but that's the open conversation.
Yeah, I guess
that we're
one
having.
question on that is like, would the code change if the value would be something else at this point?
Well, at this point, the code would change because the code is wired up right now as is in that PR to recognize, to look for the key and the value. So only the key and the value matching engages the code change.
Oh, I mean, I meant like something like, let's just say that the value changes from external autoscaler to whatever the AWS incarnation of it is, I forget. Would the behavior of that, like, because the replica is managed by something else, like change? So would the code change if like it was a different thing?
I think in practice, the particular change in terms of doing non-predictive scaling, so just saying something like, I know there's a scaling event, but I don't understand it because I'm externally managed. That would probably carry over to additional use cases like you described, but additional use cases you described might be interesting in terms of other parts of the code, and so they may engage different subtle changes. So I think the important point is that the way it's implemented now is specifically for external autoscaler, and we want to define the particular contract for the annotation that informs that particular autoscaler change.
Okay, I could get by that as I mean, yeah, usually we don't check values. I also would like to call out that like if we have a lot of like different values in here, just for the sake of them, we probably should block them, as in like this should be generic enough that any external autoscaler could go into that bucket.
Correct. That is actually how it's meant to be sort of used.
But on the flip side,
there isn't a webhook here which enforces. So that could be an addition to this PR where we could literally. Actually, that's not true. That would be on the provider side, but we could add that to the documentation where you know if you implement this webhook and you make sure to only allow this value, otherwise, unknown, like Cappy's not going to do anything. It's not going to guarantee any particular outcome. Yeah,
but I was going to say though, like on the flip side, now having this annotation only respect one value, it's insignificant because there is only one value at the end of the day. So I can also see Cecile's point. It's like, why are we even enforcing that value? Because it could be more significant at that point, like to be.
Right. Well, the reason we're doing that is because the actual significance of what that annotation means has been removed from the key string. That's the reason why. Because replicas managed by could be Cappy, like without any. If we simply took that as a bool.
No, actually, it should not. Replicas managed by, or like just managed by something else, is not like, I would never say like this would be managing cluster API because that should be the default, as in this annotation does not exist. But the managed by for the external infrastructure that you already push through accepts any value. And the point of that is that, like, for example, you could use it as debugging purposes, or you could have like different systems that you don't recognize. Gosh, I'm trying to figure out like which one is the AWS autoscaler or I forget. So there's cluster autoscaler, which Mike knows about it a lot, and then Carpenter. Yes, thank you. So like something that could be significant here is like, hey, I want that to be Carpenter instead of like, which is something a bit more specific because I might have multiple autoscalers that I'm trying out. So I could see, but basically just say, hey, allow anything. And but we assume that, hey, if this is there, even if it's an empty string, I guess that's what we do for the other, whatever the other behavior is, should be the same.
Okay, that all makes 100% sense. I'm coming to this as a novice, and I read that annotation as having an absence of significance. But there's clearly a pattern whereby when you say managed by, the context is strict, like outside of myself. Like I'm not. That is a well-established pattern of essentially declaring I'm not managing this, someone else is, and I wasn't aware of that because it's sort of not obvious as a novice that that's what that means.
Yep.
So if that's the case, then I agree with everything else that you said, that it would be preferable and arguably more flexible in the ways that we want flexibility to have it be a bool.
Yep. I think that also it clears up like a bunch of other problems that, like, you might have like, hey, I want to have like a different behavior for another kind of autoscaler that's outside, which is not something we probably want for Cluster API to go into that territory.
Right.
You know, like,
so
yeah.
I mean, basically, it allows provider flexibility, which is really where the flexibility should be focused.
Yep.
Whereas CAPI can simply generically say, I don't know about all these things. These are provider specific, but I do know that I am not going to predict which direction this is scaling anymore, because the provider is not leaning on me for doing the scaling enforcement.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, I think what Vince is saying makes a lot of sense to me as well. Like if we already have a pattern established for the way we're using annotations in a similar manner with some of the other externally managed things, we shouldn't break that pattern and create like unexpected, surprises here. Like, unfortunately, like as an API field, I would love to see this as more of an enumeration, but I get what we're talking about here in terms of it's better to probably leave this open-ended in terms of the value, so that each individual provider could do what they wanted to with it. Because I could imagine like AWS, the AWS provider might want to be able to key off of Carpenter or Cluster Autoscaler, right? Like it might want to allow you to choose which management method you want. And that would be totally up to the provider implementation to then decide something to do with it. So yeah, good discussion. I guess this also
I'm 100%. I'm 100% on the other side now. So the discussion was
right.
critical.
I think this also highlights the difficulty in using annotations as like, API, right?
No comment, because I want to not
Yeah.
have this meeting go over.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Anyways, any other questions or comments on this that people would like to get in here? All right, cool. Thank you, Jack. Interesting topic, and people please go take a look at the PR. Killian, you're up next with cluster network CIDR blocks, and then updating the API versions for owner references.
Can you open the issue 7420 there, please? It's the one that isn't actually linked, but it's linked in the other issue. So this, I brought up before KubeCon. I sent out a mail on the mailing list just to get feedback for it, to see if anybody had a problem with it. The essential issue is that today Cluster API doesn't do any validation on the CIDR blocks that are defined in the cluster network. So we've got two CIDR blocks, pods and services. Today, that's just an array of strings. You can put things that aren't IPs in there. So this PR, and when you do that, the assumption in those fields in Cluster API is that they'll be passed to something like kubeadm. Today, kubeadm has strict validation of those fields and will fail. And then the Kubernetes components, depending on which of those they need, will take in those fields as flags. And they also do their own validation on them. So we're trying to build this validation into Cluster API. But this is a breaking change. So the validation is a maximum of 2 strings in this array. Each of the strings is a valid IP. And if there are 2 strings, then it should be dual stack. So you can't have 2 IPv4 CIDR blocks or 2 IPv6 CIDR blocks. You need to have 1 IPv4 and 1 IPv6. If there's 2, if there's a single one, it just needs to be valid, one or the other. So this PR has evolved a little bit, but this is a breaking change. So I think we put a hold in it, and I just want to give people the next couple of days to have a look at it. There is one issue that came up during implementation that's also in this PR, which is that, and that's the second issue that I linked on the notes. So today, Cluster API defines a cluster IP family, which advertises whether the cluster is running on IPv4, IPv6, or dual stack. Yeah, that one. this is a calculation that's done. So this wasn't part of validation. It's calculation that was done when we introduced IPv6 for testing. So it was actually initially used in the Docker provider to set up the load balancer, which requires this kind of strict validation of the cluster's IP family. But this is not a concept that actually exists in Kubernetes itself. And the calculation here is whether the pod and service IP families are compatible. So I think my list here, I think if you scroll down, Stefan has a better complete table. Yeah, this is how the calculation is done. And a number of them are invalid. So IPv6, IPv4, mixing them between pods and services is invalid. And there's a couple of other cases there. So the current cluster network validation that was done in the previous PR does include this concept for now. But I think we would strongly consider getting rid of it if people thought that this isn't a concept that actually makes sense. But I want to get feedback from providers, from users, whether this sort of thing is an appropriate definition for Kubernetes. So today the only place we really use this inside of Cluster API is we expose it as a variable when we're using topology managed clusters. So whatever external service can get the variable, whatever patch can get the variable and find out what IP family the cluster is operating from. But yeah, I think we're not sure that this is because Kubernetes doesn't have the concept of an IP family for an entire cluster. We're not sure whether it's useful or whether it will clash with some other end user usages of setting up pods and services.
Okay, that is complicated, but I think it makes sense. Looking at the 7420 PR here, given the hold on it, do you want to put a time before you'd like to get comments, or do you just want to leave this open until everyone's had a chance to kind of weigh in on it?
So we have broadcast this PR kind of widely for the last few weeks. So I think this can merge and then we can make the validation stricter in future. That check was already validated on topology managed clusters, but not on unmanaged clusters. So if everybody's happy with it, if nobody has objections, I think we could merge this in a couple of days if there's no additional comments, and then continue the question, because adding this strict validation is really good, I think, because clusters will fail without it and it's just an unvalidated field. And it brings up this other discussion, which is probably more long running. And yeah, it might take a while to figure out whether a cluster should have an IP family when managed by Cluster API as opposed to Kubernetes itself.
Okay, cool. So it's fair to say maybe if there's no other objections by Friday, then we can merge this after that.
Yeah, if nobody disagrees with that, I'm fine with that.
Well, hopefully if they disagree, they'll go put their comments on the PR, right? All right, cool. I guess does anyone have questions or comments about the CIDR block validation topic or the cluster IP families? All right, I'm not seeing any hands going up, so if you want to go on to the next one, please do.
Yeah, can you open up the next issue there, 7224? So this is something we're planning to do in Cluster API, hopefully in the next week. That should probably make it into the beta. It shouldn't be a breaking change or have any impact on providers, but it might be useful to know. So the issue right now is that when you update Cluster API and then update clusters running Cluster API from, let's say, v1 alpha 3 the whole way to v1 beta 1, all of your API objects are updated, but their owner references aren't. So your machine deployments are still owned by a v1 alpha 3 cluster, which is absolutely fine today. Everything works as affected, and the main thing impacted by this, or one of the major things impacted by this, is garbage collection. So when we delete objects, everything that is owned by them, if it doesn't have any other owner reference, should in turn be deleted by Kubernetes garbage collection. Once we stop serving older versions of the API. So V1 Alpha 3 has been out of support for 6 months, more than 6 months, closer to 9 months. Eventually it'll be removed. I don't think there's any concrete plans to remove it. But once we stop serving V1 Alpha 3, the owner references become unresolvable by Kubernetes, and background deletion won't work. There might be other issues depending on how clients are used to get, if people are going through owner references, then to get the owners. So the plan is to do an audit of where we're setting owner references in Cluster API and bump all of the owner references when they essentially on every reconcile, make sure that the owner reference is correct in terms of its API version, and bump it when it's not and patch the object inline. Like I said, this shouldn't have any impact on providers or consumers of Cluster API, but it's something that providers might want to look into themselves, because this is probably an essential step in getting rid of older API versions where that's wanted. So if you don't do this, then at least garbage collection breaks, which means all of the clusters that are older, that have been upgraded through multiple API versions, won't be able to be deleted properly or easily. So yeah, I think it's good to take a look at this issue. I have one work in progress PR to do this for just the machine set machine deployments, but we're hoping to roll this out across CAPI before the next release.
Cool. Yeah, sounds like a very necessary change. And I guess if you're running a cluster where you've still got like a V1 Alpha 3 cluster, maybe it is time to update some of those objects, right?
And also, yeah, well, maybe the older ones are the ones least likely to be deleted as well, but still.
Okay. All right, cool. Thanks, Killian. Any questions about the owner reference updates? I see that Stefan is also saying in chat here that's also probably good performance wise, if everyone who uses the owner reference doesn't have to go through the conversion. All right, I'm not seeing any hands go up, so we'll bounce back to Jack here for something about the managed Kubernetes and cluster API.
Yes. All right. Another link pasted. Make sure this is the right issue. Yes. So I'm pasting a link to an issue opened by Richard Case, which I don't believe Richard is here, but super grateful for this very thorough description of a very complicated scenario to summarize. So this is an active conversation around how we might solve for managed Kubernetes and cluster API itself. And I really just wanted to ask what would be the best way to form a working group that was sort of well documented, how we meet as inclusive and inviting as possible for any folks who might want to join. Would it make sense to produce an issue or a proposal PR that sort of the objective is to gather consensus around a Zoom channel when we meet, all that kind of thing, so we can, because a lot of these this is going to require a lot of, I think, real-time discussion, at least in the coming months, because there isn't consensus yet on this issue, and it's super complicated. It's really hard to think that it exceeds the ability of this particular medium to solve the consensus problem. So do we have any precedents of organizing a working group in such a way?
I mean, I was just going to say, like, I'm trying to think. I think we've done like smaller working groups before, but not, like I was thinking the release team is like the most effective kind of group that we've organized recently within the community. This topic seemed to be, people were really interested in it at the KubeCon Contributor Summit. So I feel like maybe if we can just advertise it enough, we could probably build a working group. I don't know. Does anyone else have comments about like, just establishing a working group, or if we should have a process around that within the cluster API community?
Yeah, if not, I'd be absolutely delighted to be the first one to try it out.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like you might be forging I know we've had groups get together to talk about specific topics before, but maybe this is a good opportunity because of the popularity of this topic. Maybe this is a good opportunity to kind of formalize some of our working group processes. So I mean, I can only suggest, like, sending out to the mailing list, talking in Slack, but then additionally, maybe if we could come up with a document about how we formed the working group to do this, like that might be a useful addition, to our community documentation as well.
Cool. Are there any objections to the idea of that additional level of formality? Because all the things you've suggested, Slack, all that's already kind of actively happening.
Right.
But my observation is that there's a likelihood that folks will be kind of left behind if they're not, the type who are hanging out in Slack all the time, might not know that these conversations are going on.
Right.
And also just might reduce friction in terms of you run into someone, oh, you guys are discussing that. How can I get involved? Well, here's a link, like it has all the information there.
Yeah. No, I think that would be good. Like that goes back to kind of making an issue or something. I just want to call out a couple chat comments here. So Winnie is saying for the first managed K8's proposal, it was just gathering people, but a working group sounds like a great idea. And then Stefan had a comment, using the office hour Zoom session and adding meeting notes in the same doc as the office hour meeting notes were helpful in the past. So I think the notion here is that if we set up a Zoom session interleaving the weekly meeting with like the other meetings in between might be helpful as a way to centralize where that's happening. I think one thing I would call out in terms of trying to set up like meetings and stuff for this is that, we have a lot of people on the other side of the planet from us, kind of North American centric folks. And so it might be difficult to find like a meeting time that kind of works for everybody. So if there was some way to either have it a little bit more asynchronous or be able to bounce meetings between different times, or I guess it'll depends who wants to be involved. But yeah, maybe making an issue is the first step here.
Great.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any hands going up. So yeah, I would say like if you want to make an issue where you at least collect the information about what's going on, or maybe use this one as like the centralizing issue, that might be a good way to organize it, at least to start with. Okay. Yeah, not seeing any hands or comments going in. So I think that brings us to the end of the regular session. Jack, do you want to take the mic one more time to tell us about what's going on with CAPZ?
Yeah, so super quick items. We plan to release 1.6 tomorrow. So that's our part of our regular monthly minor release cadence. And then the second one, thank you for clicking on this link, is just a call out that we're actively in the process of integrating 1.3 into CAPZ. So the objective is to integrate that before the release so that we have more comprehensive signal to report back before we cut CAPI 1.3. That's it.
Awesome. Sounds great. So that brings us to the end of our meeting agenda with just about 8 minutes left here. Does anybody have any other ad hoc topics or things they want to bring up, or should we take some time back in our day here? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. Thanks everybody for coming out, and yeah, we'll see you in Slack and see you here next week.
Thanks, Mike.
Bye.